And good evening, everyone, and welcome to BT's History on the Fly. Tonight, the 18th of October, we're going to continue our adventure, and for us, it's where Gretchen and I started. I'm Al Beatty, and with me tonight is my lovely wife, Gretchen, who's getting her goggles on. There we go. And we're from Boise, Idaho. And when I say where we got started, we're going to tie, we each had a first fly, and even as old as we are, we remember what it was. So I'll be tying my first pattern, and Gretchen will be tying hers. And would you like me to show the recipe on yours, or do you want to talk about it a little bit first?
Oh, I don't have too much to say, except, of course, I'm not going to be tying it on the rotary. We've taken the rotary back into the other room, so I'm just going to tie it on the regular vise. But I think my dad thought this would be an easier fly. And I think I probably, instead of a 10, which I'm tying tonight, I probably tied it on an 8. And I used some of his silk, which I'm not using tonight. I'm just using some other stuff. But this is pretty close to the first fly he finally let me tie.
You ready to show the recipe?
Sure.
Okay.
I'm using, this is tied a size 14 to an 8. And I'm going to be tying a 10 today to make sure you can see it, with black thread, red hackle barbs for the tail, yellow yarn. Actually, we're using crochet, or not crochet, embroidery thread.
Yeah.
And grizzly hackle and the thread head. Very simple fly, but it does catch fish. This is the pattern of where we're going. I tied one earlier today so you could see where we're going. So we might as well get started.
Want to give the materials?
Yeah, over here's my materials. You can see I've got the tailing material. This is the embroidery material that we've got. Here's some grizzly hackle for the tail, my thread, hooks, scissors. I think I'm ready to go. This is so simple that I kind of feel like I'm missing something. Should be something more, right?
Well, anyway, I've got a hook in the vise for you, so you can go for it.
Okay, thanks. So we'll start out with the tail here. I've been so busy this summer, haven't had much time to tie, so this is a good way to start out. I'm going to start my base wrap pretty close to the 1/3 point, just kind of as a marker, and put on a nice base wrap. I'm going to go a little short of the end of the shank, so I've got a little bare spot there. As you probably have heard us talk before, we like to tie our hackle fiber tails onto the bare hook here at the end, so that there's not a thread for them to drop off of, and they seem to stay straighter that way. So, and this feather does not want to give up its material very easy. Oh, I got it. Last time I had to cut it off. So I'll just take a little bit, and remember, with a hackle fiber, we like to tie the tail the full length of the hook, which goes from the bend clear to the eye. We'll set it in place. Notice I hold it a little bit towards me so that the thread torque will set it right up on top. Tie it pretty tight till I get down here close to the end. I want to keep track. There we go. That is tending to want to go down a little bit. And so I think I'll just take a quick wrap under that tail. That'll keep it from bending down. And to do that, I went from the what we call the pull point, and go straight back. If you get too close to the tailing material, when you do that, it has a tendency to pull it up too far. And all I want to do is just put a thread under there so that it, without a lot of pressure. So I've taken a piece of the embroidery thread and taken it apart. So I've actually got just 3 of the strands there. That's all I needed on this small of a hook. So we'll tie it on. Now, if I were being really fussy about this fly, I could have tied the base wrap in white, because when this gets wet, it is probably going to dull the body a little bit because of the black showing through. But we didn't do that. So I decided I needed to be true to what we did. As you can see, you can kind of straighten those threads out as you go, so it's kind of flat and it lays nice and close to the previous wrap. Notice I took a wrap around and then I'll bring it up. Whoa. I need some help with your vise here. Okay. Come on. There we go. A nice smooth area here for my hackle. We have some pre-selected hackle, as you saw earlier. I used this on the go-to fly, so this is the one that I want to use now. And we always just had bare hackle the same distance on both sides. So I did that, but I'm going to leave a little bare stem right there so that my hackle will lay right. And just start wrapping. Looks good. 1, 2 wraps. Pull it back and dogleg it back into itself. Trim it off. And as you notice, to trim that off, I just bring the V point of my thread onto the hackle, and it just breaks it right off. I got a little piece that's sticking out there. I'm not sure why. Okay. I think I got him captured. And we'll do a whip finish, and we'll do the good whip finish going from the back to the front. And there you have a gray hackle yellow. And that was one of my dad's favorite flies. He fished that a lot when he was fishing. I fished it some growing up, but I think I probably fished a renegade more than anything else. But that was the first one that I tied. Any questions? Sometimes the simplest flies can be really good. You can tie this wet. You can tie the streamer. You can tie a bunch of different ways.
Back in those days, most of the hackle you got was close to wet or darn near it, or awful big, one of the two.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes you would use 2 hackles just to get enough on there. So no questions.
I got a quick question. I'm remembering back in the 60s when I started, it seemed to me, at least it was difficult for me to determine then whether a fly was a dry fly or a wet fly because they seemed to be tied both ways. Is that the way you remember it?
Absolutely. In fact, I can remember when I first started tying with Al, I had difficulty. I kept saying, how can you tell a dry fly from a wet fly? I really struggled with that. So yeah.
Don't have a good answer for you either. It's just a lot of times you look at the name the customer has on the order form and said, "Oh, that's a dry fly." So, because they're both ways and sometimes even tied both ways.
Well, I mean, to this
Back
day,
then,
the Cahills tied both wet and dry, or the
yeah,
Lake Cahill, for instance. But back then, it seemed like all flies had wet and dry versions. As a matter of fact, flies that were really wet flies, like the cow dung. Um, I fished a dry cow dung when I was in the 60s.
Some of the early classes I had taught that, or they demoed that if it was a wet fly, you tied it on with the shiny side forward. And when you did a dry fly, you reversed that.
Huh.
So that the hackle kind of went forward towards the eye of the hook for the dry fly, and the tips of the hackle pointed back for the wet fly. And now with the hackles we have, they go on, and with a little tension, no matter which way you do it, they seem to go straight out of the shank.
that's one of the positives of genetic hackle we have today.
Yeah, I remember a lot of books they used to show the on dry flies, they would show the hackles angling forwards. Whereas now, or I'm going to say within the last 30 years, 25 years, it seems like everybody's doing it the opposite way. I mean, they stick out straight anyway, so it doesn't really matter, because it's easier to tie off.
When did they start tying with hair? The only hair my dad ever tied with was polar bear. He had some polar bear or some, I don't know if it was otter or mink or something. Anyway, but he did not tie with deer hair and elk hair. Did they tie with that back when, or was it just that he didn't?
I tied with it all through the 70s.
Well, we're talking
Yeah, they had
50.
the wolf flies and the bucktails, and they were tying with a lot of hair in the 60s.
Oh, he had bucktails, now that I think about it.
Yeah.
But he didn't do a lot of the harrowing type stuff that we do. And I'm talking tying from the 50s, not even the 60s. The 40s and the 50s is when he tied commercially.
They probably used some skunk too.
No, I don't remember any skunk, but he might have.
Just out of interest, back in the 60s, those flies you're referring to, did they use a lighter wire for the dry fly and a heavier wire for the wet fly?
There was some of that for sure.
So that may be one way of telling the difference if you could tell the difference between the heaviness of the wire.
Well, we're not talking that you couldn't tell the difference by looking at it. You couldn't tell the difference by looking at a recipe. Is this Dark Hendrickson? Is it a wet fly or a dry fly? And that was actually both.
I'll be right back.
Oh, okay.
I mean, as a kid, and again, this is 68, 69, I remember just having thread, chenille, bucktail, cattail. That's kind of what I tied with, marabou and that kind of stuff. And then whatever thread I could find at Ben Franklin. But then, Al and I kind of grew up in a fly tying paradise up in Northwest Iowa. Not really.
Okay,
There was nothing out there.
We do have a question. They wanted to know how old I was. I guess how old when I tied that first fly? Well, let me think. We lived in Boise, so I had to be at least 10. I would say I was probably a teenager, probably 14, 15. He just got tired of me messing with his feathers and finally decided to teach me to tie, I think.
Okay, if we're ready to move on, we'll move into mine, but I don't want to leave anybody with questions.
Well, that yellow hackle fly was often used on the Mackenzie River and often used on the Upper Santiam River here in the Salem Willamette Valley.
My dad used it a lot in Snake there just off in the Teton Park, just out of Jackson Lake, where below the dam where the water came out. He fished that particular fly a lot there. I remember that.
We got to put the roadmap fly up.
Okay, you want me to go to the vise?
No, let's start right here first.
Okay.
Okay, well, I got my first tying kit, or I got a tying kit, first flies that I tied when I was for my 14th birthday. And about a month later, I started selling flies. And for the first 2 years, all I tied was the fly you're going to see tonight. And that's what the customer ordered. And I'll tell you as we go along more of the story that goes with it. But I started on a vise that doesn't look too dissimilar from this, except it was some kind of pot metal. And well, all I can tell you is that after I had been tying for about a month on it, it came in a herder's tying kit. It broke. And I tied freehand in for the next year or so until my dad took pity on me and took a small pair of vice grips in his shop and welded a 3/8 piece of metal to it, and that was my vise for a long time, was an old vice grips. I got one around here somewhere, and we'll share it with you sometime. But anyway, that's what I started on. So I'll be tying on a vise tonight when we tie that guy right there. And it was a Bucktail Streamer. There was information in that fly tying kit from herders that gave three patterns. And like I said, this is the only one I ever tied because when I got my tying kit, I didn't have a fly rod. I didn't know how to fly cast. I learned how to tie flies. Took my first fly to a nearby lake, and with an old steel bait casting rod with black woven line on it and a red and white bobber plastic, I threw it out there with a leader off of that, and that's how I caught my first fish. And I fished that way for the first year. I did not have a fly rod until a year later, and I got that fly rod making money by tying for the local hardware store, tying a few flies, and trapping pocket gophers for the bounty that the state paid for pocket gophers at that time, which was 10 cents a gopher. And at the time, I think I was selling the flies to the hardware store for about 10 cents a piece, give or take. I don't remember. It might have been, it doesn't make any difference. Anyway, it wasn't a heck of a lot of money. But at the end of a year, I had enough money to get my first fly rod, cost $15. And it was just great. I still got it around here someplace. I forget what brand it was, but anyway, we've got it around here someplace. To tie this fly tonight, now let me get over to the materials real quick and just set some stuff out so I can kind of see what I got going here. Because one of the things that I didn't have access to, in fact, I never saw a fly shop until the late 70s, and it was in West Yellowstone, Montana, that I saw my first fly shop. And so I was almost 40 years old then, late 30s anyway. And getting materials was You know, we often joke about the presentations that we do here that we're making do with whatever we have available. Well, the pattern you're seeing tonight is an example of a make do fly. I didn't have what the recipe called for the beard, for example. So I went out into the chicken house and I found a feather on the floor, and that's how I found several more. They were kind of fuzzy and everything. Well, I have since learned that those feathers are actually called chickaboo now, and Henry Hoffman made them pretty famous by selling them. But at the time, they were just a fuzzy feather laying on the floor, and that's how I tied my first fly, and that guy right there. But anyway, to start, I didn't have thread like you guys do. My mother would get her thread like this, and then she would take spools, empty spools, put it on her Singer machine, and load those spools off of the big ones here. And I think these are about 6,000 yards, give or take. It doesn't make any difference. There's a lot of thread here. And that's what I started with is working off of one of these spools. You just pull off a few chunks. And one of the things the tying kit did have in it was a block of beeswax. And so I just kind of wax the thread a bit using sewing thread. Yeah, that looks good
I
enough.
didn't know there was special thread for tying till I met you.
I didn't either until I got into commercial tying. After I moved to Idaho, up until then, I was using sewing thread. I didn't know any better. Anyway, so I've got a piece of thread. Let me just get over here. And no bobbin. All I had was the vise that ended up breaking. And then, of course, my second flight tonight, I'm going to tie will be freehand, no bobbin. So that, anyhow, when I started out with that, you just start out with kind of at the front of the hook, wrap a few turns, and it's just like today, you wrap back to the back of the hook, lay down a good nice base wrap so you've got a good base on which to apply your other materials. And the bobbin that I'm using right now, my fingers, is not doing a good job of holding it where I want it. It keeps slipping. But anyway, I guess I'll live through that. Let me trim that off. Now back over at the materials area, I've got some yarn here that we use for the tail. It's just regular old yarn. You know, it was the same thing back in the 50s. It was 4-strand. I don't think it's changed a bit over the years, except maybe was made out of some different materials, and I don't even know that for a fact. But anyway, back over at the vise, we'll get that tied on. This afternoon was the first time in probably 10, 15 years that I tied a fly without a bobbin. God, it felt funny.
Well, you did use a bobbin on that when you were doing the rotary, didn't you?
The rotary.
When you're tying on the rotary machine.
Oh, no, I used it without a bobbin. But that's the first time that's all you do is hold materials in your hands, and the hook goes round and round. And anyhow, I'll get to my tail kind of fuzzed up a little bit here with that. And by the way, I did not use a mustache comb back in those days. I didn't know that there was a brush would fuzz it up real good. So I used the point of my scissors like that to fuzz it up, and it fuzzes up a lot easier with the brush. Anyway, let's see, what do I want next? I want the body material. So let's go to the materials. And my body material is going to be yellow floss, just like Gretchen did. And one of the things that I ran into a problem with the instructions that I got, the little pamphlet is all it was, in this fly tying kit, is it talked about putting head cement on the head when you got done. Well, quite frankly, I couldn't find any head cement. What's that? The only fingernail polish that I knew about was what my mother used, and it was red, various colors of red that seemed to kind of have to match the lipstick that she was wearing. I don't know whether that was the case. The ladies are going to have to answer that question for me. I don't know that for a fact, but that seemed to be what it was. So I didn't know where to get it. So anyway, one day my dad was going to the hardware store, and I asked him if I could go along with him, and and he said sure. And anyway, and so while he was doing whatever he was doing in the hardware store, I asked the owner of the store. I said, "I'm looking for some clear kind of glue stuff that I can put on this fly." Oh, he says, "I got just the stuff you need here right now." And I think that's a pretty good looking fly. Would you tie some for me? And that's how it all started, because as it turned out, he was a streamer fisherman and he didn't have the time to tie himself. So anyhow, that's how I got my first order, and I tied flies for him. And then later, oh, probably 6 months later, as summer rolled around, I got that tying kit in the winter. As summer rolled around, he had me snell some hooks for him too. And I don't know, I probably snelled 50, 60 hooks, not a lot, but enough to know about snelling hooks and all that stuff. And because back in those days, they sold hooks on a card, usually 3 hooks with snells on the card. Anyway, I've got the body on, and we'll just, let me throw a little half hitch in there. Trim off the waist. Set that aside. Let's see, what do I need next? Oh, yeah. Now, I didn't say anything in the instructions on what to do with this bucktail, and I didn't have a full bucktail in the instructions. I had one little chunk about so big of red bucktail, and so I only had red bucktail streamers for a while, as long as I had that. And then about that time is when I would talk to that owner of the hardware store, and he hunted and had a few just natural white ones. And in fact, he asked me to tie the bucktail streamers for him as a white wing bucktail, and that's what I did. But anyway, there was nothing about stacking it, so I would just kind of line stuff up a little bit so it wasn't quite so misaligned. Do it the best I could, and then tie it on the hook. And so it wasn't stacked. In fact, as I said, it was, well, geez, it was a long time before I even knew what a hair stacker was. And then I made some for me, and you all have seen my hair stackers that are made from chapstick tubes, and they've served me well over the years. Anyhow, I'll get that tied in place here. I used to be really good at guessing how much thread I needed, and boy, I'm getting short here. I may be in trouble, guys. I just don't know. We'll have to see. I'll grab this chickaboo feather. It was an on the hen house floor feather is what it really was, but just tied that in place. I think it was where I remember reading, I think it was Dutch Bachman's introduction to one of our fly tying Fridays, and he went to Mama's sewing basket for thread. Well, he isn't the only one. And I do have a problem. I'm just ran out of thread too quick. I'll have to do some splicing here. There we go. Now I'm just going to wax myself another short section of thread. And any questions while I'm getting this waxed up? Pick the wax up off the floor. Oh. anyhow, after I got a bobbin, I didn't waste near as much thread as I did. But in time, when you tie, I'll just get that all wrapped in place there again. Throw in a half hitch.
Al,
Yeah.
when you're talking about sizes of thread, I think sewing thread, normal sewing thread is listed as size A. And I was wondering, do you remember the conversion, what A is equivalent to in terms of the aught? I think it was like a 2-aught.
I don't know about the aught, but it's like 210 denier, isn't it?
It might be. Yeah. So, because that I know that a lot of the flies from that period that you tied and I tied early on too, the heads were much larger than they are today. It was hard to get those small heads.
Absolutely. There's no way we would get the heads. And I'm not even worrying about a head. I was just glad that I got everything under the thread. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the way I was at the time, and slop on some glue so it wouldn't fall apart, and I was pretty happy.
Yeah.
Anyway, one of the things that I want to go into though is there was in this pamphlet that I got in this fly tying kit. Like I said, there was 3 patterns. I only tied one. That was the Bucktail Streamer, and it talked about everything was done with line drawings. I think you remember back in those days, if you were lucky, you might get a black and white picture of the fly at the first part of the chapter, and then after that, everything was in some kind of a line drawing. Well, I figured out how to do a half hitch from the line drawing, but there is absolutely no way I could figure out how to do the whip finish with these fingers that would like this all the way through it. I said, oh, Jesus. So I didn't know what to do. And my mother gave me the solution that actually ended up becoming the basis for the tie wrap system here in the last few years. And if any of you in the audience have ever done any seamstress type work or seamster type work, or whatever it's called when guys do it, you ever heard of a whip stitch? Well, there's a way to tie off a whip stitch, and just in case you haven't heard of one, I'll show you what one looks like. I looked one up on the internet today. That's a whip stitch. Just 2 pieces of cloth, and you kind of go around the edge, and then you open that up, and here's how you tie it off. You throw a loop through it, and then you go back through that loop again. So basically, it's a half hitch with 2 loops through it. And that's how you finished it. Well, that's what my mother showed me. And I gotta tell you, for the first probably 2-3 years that I tied flies, I tied all my flies off with that knot right there. And that's what I'm going to do right now. We'll go back to here, get over here. And all you got to do is just, you come through the loop a couple times. And I'll just slip that up over the hook. And I'd put 2 of those on. I knew there was something wrong. I haven't put my glasses on yet. I was having a heck of a time seeing, and I'll bet this will make things a lot clearer. Oh, there we go. Yes.
Al, you mentioned you went into the hardware store and asked them for something clear and sticky. What did they give you?
The same thing I used for years and years and years. It was some kind of a spar varnish, and I'm pretty sure it was something really bad for thinning it. And in fact, my first order of flies, first order of flies and some snells I did for the guy. It was a trade for the glue that I got. So anyhow, any questions there? And there, of course, that's the final version of the fly, tied off with I don't know what the knot's called. I guess you just call it a whip stitch knot.
I had a Navy veteran student here, well, probably about 6 years ago, that for the life of me, he could not figure out a whip finish. So he was doing that. And one day I'm noticing, what are you doing? And he explained it to me, and it worked perfectly good as far as I was concerned. So I didn't bother teaching him a whip finish.
It does a really good job. Surprisingly, it holds really well. And I probably fished, I don't know, just pulling it out of the sky that first year after I got the tie-in kit. I had several flies that didn't go to the store that I kept for myself, and I never even put any glue on them. And I fished them for a while, and eventually they start coming apart. But you put a couple of those whip stitch things on, and they work for mom sewing, and they work for the fly too. But in later years, I did learn to do the whip finish. But the actual whip finish that I used for a whole lot of years was, if you've ever seen an old rod building book by Dale Clements, back in the 60s, I think it was. And you just take basically a loop of thread and lay it down, and you wrap several turns over it, and then use that loop of thread that's under those other turns to pull it back through. And I did something very similar, except I used a piece of monofilament as kind of a jig, if you will, to wrap over and then pull back through. But anyhow, any other questions?
Al, any rod builder knows exactly what you're talking about, because we use that particular loop on, probably on a typical rod 50, 60 times.
Yep, it's I have not built a lot of rods. I don't know, probably 6 or 8 in my life, but I had run across that book at a library way back when I was still in high school, as I recall. I think that's where I saw it. But anyway, Dale Clements was the author. I never forgot. And what I found so intriguing, it was one of the first books that had colored photographs, and he would do some of the most intricate interweaving on his guide wraps that were just totally phenomenal. But that isn't why we're here tonight. But
yeah, I've got that book someplace. I'll have to get it, look it up.
Yeah, I got all of his books, and
I had a question.
How I learned them, how to learn how to build rods.
Amy wanted to know, would the hand tying without tools be a good method for teaching children the beginning of tying? Might help them learn about thread tension. I don't know. I think it's awfully hard.
You know what? If you could get them, you're going to see that here in a minute, and you can decide whether that's a good thing or not. There's some very positive things about it, but Jesus, with kids and sharp hooks, I think the first thing you would do is cut the point off the hook if they're going to learn that way. I'd be very concerned about teaching some even 10, 12-year-old kids what you have to do tying freehand, I call it. That's what I'm going to be doing next.
Wonderwear by Revlon. That was, in fact, I still got my bottle of head cement right here. And then I used something by Pactra right there. Still moves. That's my original bottle of head cement when I started tying flies. I used this stuff from Pactra, and it was non-toxic cement for plastic models. And I used a little toothpick, and that's how I would wrap around the nylon thread.
Excellent. Thank you for that information. Anything else, folks?
Paulie Rossborough, he used to go down to the hardware store and buy a gallon of varnish, and then he'd buy all these little bottles and pour it into there, and after he would sell 2 little bottles, he probably paid for the gallon.
I was just sitting there thinking the same darn thing. Now, didn't you tie with the lady from back east?
Mary Deddy.
Deddy. And she tied with that. And in fact,
she put varnish in a hypodermic needle, and she was tying that day. She was tying what am I trying to say? The hackle. Oh gosh, come on, Gretchen. Anyway, she would take a neck and put it in
Oh, she quill bodies?
Yeah, she was doing quill bodies. Okay. So after she would get the quill body on, she would just take that hypodermic needle and cover that quill body with varnish.
Yeah.
And that was pretty stout fly.
Yeah, I bet it was.
She was a fun lady to tie with. We had a good time.
If you're teaching kids, to tie in hand, one thing you probably should do is use a barbless hook. If you
Yeah.
don't want to cut the point off completely, make sure you use a barbless hook.
For
Until
sure.
you get used to that tension.
Absolutely, for sure. I'd be a little squeamish about that.
Well, I want to see you tie in the hand. I haven't watched you do that.
Oh, I got to tell you a story about tying in hand, and it kind of got me back into it way back when. Let's see, it was back in the early 90s, maybe 92 or 93. Anyway,
Have to be 92.
we were in at a show in Holland, and I was sitting and talking with Darwin Atkin. Now, I think some of you know who he was. He was a very prominent person in Federation of Fly Fishers before it changed names to Fly Fishers International. He had passed on by that time. But he was like the grandfather, if you will, of the demonstration fly tying in the Federation. And anyway, I saw him sitting on the riverbank there in Holland, kind of taking a break, or I thought he was. He was sitting around, fiddling around with something. I came out, "What are you doing, Darwin?" Oh, he said, "There's this guy from the UK that's going to be demonstrating this afternoon, tying full dress Atlantic salmon flies with no vise." He said, "I'll be danged if he's going to be the only one around here that can't tie or that can tie without it with hands free." And I said, "Oh, wow, that's a cool idea. I used to do that all the time." And we chatted for a bit. And so Darwin went and demonstrated that afternoon after practicing on the riverbank for a bit. He was doing muddlers with really beautifully trimmed heads, all tied in hand. Either he had done it at some point in time or he learned really fast. I'm not sure which.
It was a spun head muddler.
Spun head muddler.
Ooh.
Spun head muddler in hand. I said, "Wow, good for you." Because tonight, folks, well, first off, these are 80-plus-year-old hands that don't hold things as good as they used to. And so I'm going to be doing a woolly bugger. No, excuse me. I'll be doing a woolly worm because back in the day when I first started tying these, we never heard of the woolly bugger. I don't think I saw a woolly bugger until I was about the mid-70s at some time. They were probably around before that, but everything was the woolly worm, and that's what you're going to see tonight. No more questions, and we'll go into that. And I've been really kind of sweating this one because one of the things about tying in hand is you put things up like this and you pull them around like that, and it's impossible to keep a camera following you unless you've got an awful good camera person. And we've got these sitting on tripods, and the tripod don't move real fast. In fact, it don't move at all. So I'm going to try to keep my hands in front of the camera. And so, Gretchen, your job is to get back into the camera routine, okay? All right. I'm going to go back over here, and I'm going to clear this all out because I don't need that. But I'm going to use this area right here as my tying platform, and I don't need that. I do need this. I need to prepare materials a little bit. Let's see. I'm going to start. Set that aside. And I'm going to prepare my hackle feather and strip that off. And one of the things that I like to do is, let's see, decide which way it's going to wrap first. Okay, this will be the side that will go against the hook. So I'm going to tear that off just a little bit better so I get a clean tie off. That's something I've learned recently and didn't use back then, but I may as well use it today because all I'm doing is demonstrating how to tie with my hands. Now, let me get all this stuff out of the way that I don't need. There's that. I do need black. And I need that for tail material. The less stuff I have in front of me, the less you have to look around, and the less of a... Okay, put that over there. There. Okay, there we go. Now, let me get my glasses again. I took them off. Want to be able to see what I'm doing. Alrighty, there we go. Now, one of the things I want to start with is just like before, I'm just going to pull some of this thread off of here. And I'll reach over and get my wax. And I'll wax up a piece of thread. Okay, and that's all waxed. Get my scissors. Now I've tied with scissors in hand practically since day one. Well, except in my teenage years when I was tying freehand. And I'm not going to try to do this and some of the gyrations I have to do. So I'm going to lay those scissors down, I think. It might be safer. I don't want to have an on-the-job injury here right in front of all of you. Put that over here. All right. Now, one of the things about tying in hand that I want to talk to you about is the tendency is going to be to hold the hook with my left hand and wrap with the right hand, because the mentality of working with a vise is mostly a one-hand wrap, and the other hand just does stuff. I mean, holds things in place and sets them here, twists there, and that kind of stuff. Well, one of the things about in-hand tying is you're not held to using just one hand. You can wrap with left hand, holding the hook in the right, and vice versa, turn things upside down like this. It's kind of up to you. Well, I'm going to start out
You better put those scissors down.
That's right. Thank you, Gretchen. They just go in my hand just like I didn't know any better. Anyway, I'm just going to start wrapping towards the back. I want to get down the thread base. And so far, this works pretty good. But now I'm getting towards the back there, and I think, the heck with it, I'm going to switch. I think I'll wrap with the other hand now for a bit. Get my scissors out here. I'll cut with my left hand now. Get that thread out of the way. All right, looking good. Now I'm going to bring my thread back just like I normally do, get a good thread base there. I'm bringing it back almost to the starting place, and I'm stopping just a little bit shy of my original starting place. And let me just do a half hitch here so that I can lay this down and pick some stuff up and fiddle around a little bit. Okay, now that gets me tied off there. Now I need to keep the trash out of my way, so I'll do that. Here's my tail material. And what I want you to notice is that I am tying the tail material on back on the hook shank just a little bit. Let me see if I can get this up to so you can see. So that there's a little space there up front. Well, you'll see why here in just a bit. And I'm just going to get some of this out of my way. And so I can continue wrapping. Now, one of the things about wrapping material, I want you to notice what happens here. Let me get this out of the way. What happens is this will just, thread torque really pushes that away. However, if I squiggle my fingers back and kind of use the pinch there a little bit to, you're putting a wrap on, squiggle the fingers, put another wrap on, squiggle the fingers. It's just another way of getting those materials in place on top of the hook. Come here. And if you don't like that, you can always go back to the traditional way of doing it. However, it's a lot easier to do this at the back of the hook by going in kind of in the pinch of the fingers and tighten it up. Let's go back into the pinch of the fingers and tighten that up. And that's looking pretty good. Yeah, yep. And I'll wrap back forward. Am I staying in the picture frame pretty good, Gret?
Yep, you're working at it. Good.
Okay, good.
I'll holler at you if you don't.
Okay, good. Thank you. Alrighty. Now, one of the things about doing a half hitch, if you try to hold back here on the hook shank, and now, okay, now it's time to do a half hitch. You don't have the weight of a bobbin or even a thread spool. You just got the thread there. It kind of gets away from you. But what seems to work pretty well for me is that I'll hold it in a pinch and let this finger slide forward. And what that does is keeps the thread from coming off, and then I can work myself into a half hitch to slip in place. Come here, you get up there. Get it in the pinch and pull it down. That'll keep it from coming apart. Now I'll just lay this down for the moment. And I've got a feather. And I've got floss. And I'll just tie those two on. I'm going to start by placing the two parallel to each other like that, pointing out the front of the hook. You'll see why here in just a minute. Let's see, I want that to be, there we go. Now you notice that I'm having to fiddle my way around that long stuff out front here. Kind of a
Those
pain.
Scissors in your hand.
Thank you, dear. God, I just can't tie without scissors in my hand. And it'll be massacre if I do. Anyway, and what I want you to notice is that I'm tying on, and I'm getting into all kinds of a mess with the thread getting tangled up with the body floss and all that stuff. This is a really great place for this kind of a tie on. You squiggle the fingers forward into the pinch, tighten down, into the pinch, tighten down. And I'm going to stop here for just a second. Trim off the waste of the body floss. And now I'll take a couple wraps on that. And now we'll just wrap to the back of the hook. In fact, I don't have to wrap with the left hand. I can use the right hand and move the hook to do the wrapping. Oh, that's kind of helpful. That's very helpful. So if you want to do some freehand tying, just remember you don't always have to. Well, let's see, I want to do this left-handed. Do the half hitch left-handed. That's really one of the places where I like to get that thing up in the air, and it's driving me nuts keeping it in front of the camera. Anyhow, so here we are. I'll just leave that thread set back there. And let's start wrapping our floss body towards the back. Get the feather and the floss body separated from each other. And notice how I'm giving the material just a little bit of a twist to flatten it out. Every time I make a turn, twist to flatten it out. Makes a better looking body that way. If you just hold on to the floss and keep wrapping, what it'll do, it'll rope up on you. And if you want a very definitive segmented type body, that's a good way to do it. But I want this more smoothed out like you would with the floss, so I give it a little twist to flatten it each time. I missed the spot right there. We go. Righty, there's that. turn around with my thread.
Up
Oh, I got off camera there, is
a
that
little
right?
bit, yeah.
No, thank you. It's easy to do. Now I'm just going to throw another half hitch in, and I'm going to do this one by hand, sort of using both hands so that I can get that just tightened off on that floss right there. Now let me trim off my floss at the back here. Try not to cut my thread at the same time. That can be a kind of a bummer. All right, there we go. Lay my scissors down. Thank you, Gretchen. I knew you was going to remind me. So now, remember where I left that hackle barbs on one side of the stem and none, and then some on the other? Well, what that does is just make a cleaner start to the application that I'm going to wrap.
To the camera.
Whoop, sorry. And now those first couple of turns were just on one side of the feather. Now I'm going to just work my way to the back of the fly. And now it's getting into kind of a tough spot here for me.
Into the camera.
Into the camera, thank you. Okay, now I'm going to rib back forward through that, kind of wiggling as I go. So we're making a pretty tough bodied woolly worm. Come here, you. Oh,
Dave wanted to know if you use hackle pliers or, well, I couldn't tying. No, the only tool he used is the scissors.
and that's the only tool that I have besides a vise that broke.
Tyers historically, who tied in hand, did use hackle pliers a lot.
It would be
And
a lot
they-
easier.
And some of them had buttons on their sewed onto the, somehow onto their workbenches that they also used to maintain tension.
Yep. Gretchen's father had a nail that he wrapped it to. Okay,
I
now
didn't
I'm
tie
just
in
going.
hand, but I used a book when I was just, using bare thread. That's all I had. I just split it into a book and held it there.
That would work. Okay, now I've got the thread through my whip stitch. And we'll do one more whip stitch. There we go.
I guess I was privileged. I've always tied with a vise. I had to make my first one, but I always had a vise.
Well, I used the vise except for about that first year after I broke the vise after about a month. And then it was about a year later that my dad took pity on me. In fact, I'll go get that vise. It's a replica of the one my dad made for me. But anyhow, I'll trim off the waist there. And there's a freehand woolly booger. Not exactly the greatest fly that I've ever tied, but it's better than some. And anyway, let me just jump up real quick and I'll be right back. Okay, well, this is not the one my dad made for me, but it's just like it, except right here where this one was actually mounted into a screw threaded hole, he welded it there. And I tied with one of those, and he had the shop, in his shop, he had one of these big heavy vices he put sickle bars and stuff like that in it to sharpen the teeth of the sickle bar. Well, I would just stand up and put that in there, and then I would tie with this, and I did that for a long time, and I spent several years standing up tying flies before I learned to sit down and tie flies. So it was well, it was just mom didn't want all that mess in her house. I don't blame her. I mean, here I am hauling the chicken house into the house, and anyway, I tied in Dad's shop for the biggest part. Anyhow, any questions?
Al, I thought it was pretty amazing how you kept it in frame. That's so hard to do.
Eric, it was an exercise in frustration, and I got to tell you, the last 2 weeks have been a real son of a gun for me because I was doing stuff that I was not totally comfortable with. I mean, I did my first fly tying demo in a big show in 1978. I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds that I've done since then, but it's so I don't even practice for them. I walk in and what do you want me to tie? Okay, I'll sit down and demonstrate it and do it. And if it's part of the repertoire of stuff that I normally do, great. And if it's not, then we'll have to negotiate from there. But anyhow, it's the last 2 weeks, this freehand tying, keeping it in front of the camera. I mean, freehand tying, I'm not concerned about, but I really like to get things up like this and cinch on them. And well, I can't quite do that and keep it in focus. It just doesn't work. And last week with the treadle sewing machine and tying with my feet and holding the materials in my hands that was a new experience too. Anyway, it's been kind of fun to do something that I wasn't quite as comfortable with as I've been over through the years.
And I just stayed out of your way.
Just a darn good idea. Just a darn good idea. Now, one of the things last week, though, as the aging process goes along, sometimes the memory lapses hit at the most inopportune times, shall we say. And I had a pretty bad senior moment last week when I was doing snelled hooks. The first snell I did, in fact, let's put it up here. The first snell I did was a uni-knot snell, and that's the one that I did commercially for that hardware store back in Iowa. So I had done a heck of a lot of the uni-knot snells. I didn't forget how to do that one, and the through-the-loop snell was pretty good. I got to the whip finish snell, and folks, I got to tell you, my mind went totally blank, and I couldn't even remember why the stuff was in the vise in front of me. And I said, "Holy Christ!" Then it finally dawned on me I was doing snells because I could see the slide up on the OBS screen. And anyway, I kind of bowled my way through it, and nobody seemed to notice that I did it wrong. Well, I'm going to make that right tonight. I don't like to leave things like that out there where I've done something that wasn't the way we wanted it. And so I'm going to snell a hook using the whip finish snell. And though I haven't done a lot of those, I think in just looking at the way it goes together and everything, that the whip finish snell is probably the best of the bunch. However, as I said, I did them commercially for, I don't know, a year or so, using the uni-knot snell. We did that last week, and it was done according to the way it should have been. So let me get back to the vise.
Al, I've had senior moments like that too, and I couldn't. My wife mentioned my grandson's name, and I said, I don't know who he is. That's scary.
It is just almost terrifying. I got to tell you, it's yeah. Anyway, I
Just so you don't forget me.
one of the things that works really well is both Gretchen and I have trouble with our memories, but we have a way of muting our communications here when we're in the studio without you guys knowing we even did it. And so we can turn it off, have a little conversation, and come back on and like we were always there. And I can't tell you the number of times either she's tying or I'm tying, and we mute everything, and I say, "Boy, I'm lost here. What's going on?" Or she'll say, "What do I do next?" And we can do that, and you guys don't even know what's happening. But when I was snelling hooks, there wasn't anything for her to fall back on. I said, "What am I doing?" She said, "I don't know." So It's the way it was. So I got some stuff here ready, and we're going to snell.
When I snelled with my dad, we went through the loop. I think that's the one we used,
Yep.
but it's been so many years.
Yep.
I can't be sure of that.
Anyway, I've just got some stuff that I got a mock-up out here. I'm gonna put a hook in the vise, just like I did last week. I want you to notice that I'm burying the point, not because that's what I do. Normally, I snell a hook in hand. I never put it in the vise. But I also can't keep it in front of a camera worth a darn that way. So one of the things that I need to do next is I'm going to temporarily use this hackle pliers to let it sit in place and hold stuff for me. And I'm going to use two things. And you may think it's kind of crazy, but actually I'm going to take a needle that I cut the point off so we wouldn't have any on-the-job injuries. And I'll just set that in there. And all that does is gives me some wiggle room to be able to work the whip part of the snell back through itself. And then I've taken just a regular dental floss threader thingy that you can get at the drugstore, and I just melted a little ball on the end of it with a cigarette lighter so that it was just easier for me to grab and not mistake it for the other end that I'm working with, that end of monofilament. I can tell which one is which because I'm going to be doing some of that in the pinch of my finger where I can't see what's going on. So the next thing that goes into this equation is the threader. Now I'm just going to start to wrap and around all of that. And going to now pull my hackle pliers out of the way because all it's doing is getting in the way. And I've got 2 turns, 3, 4, 5, and I usually do 6 turns to my whip finishes. 6. Now I'm going to reach back here and grab that little knob and pull this up pretty close. And slip my whip finish up through that. And now I'm just going to go ahead and pull that up almost snug. Now, this will all be too tight to be able to pull that loop and the monofilament through until I pull out the needle. Now the needle, now I've got room to pull everything through. Whoops, dropped it. And there we go. Now it pulls down tight. And we've got a snell done with a whip finish. And I'll get my scissors out here. Put all that aside. Now there's a formula that I used in the past, and all I would do is ask the customer how long do they want the snell, and then I would make that measurement. And when I first started, I was using a figure 8 knot for the loop, and I don't remember where I learned it, but anyway, I then learned the perfection loop, which is the one that is used for all of them, and that's what I'll use right now. Let me just pull that out of the vise temporarily so that I can just put my hand up here. And the perfection loop is this way. You take and twist the mono to the back. So you're just forming a loop, but it's at the right goes under the left. Now we're going to make a smaller loop that goes to the back, in behind, and then comes back forward. So it's a loop in front, but the tag end goes to the back and comes back through, and then you bring the little one through the big one, and you've got your perfection loop snell. Let me snug up the other one here. I can't see it to pull it. There we go. And there you've got a perfection loop snell. And the other end looks like that. Okay, any questions?
Yeah, Al, how long, knowing full well that the perfection loop is going to take up some of your monofilament, did you say you had a formula for how long to make the mono so that you always came
There,
out fairly close?
I make two measurements on a stretch. Let's say the hook is over here, the end of the monofilament is over here. The customer says, I want 8-inch snells. And I always leave 1.25 inches that I formed the loop out of for the perfection loop, unless I requested something else. I had one customer in Modesto for a while that wanted to have the snells done on 3/4, so it made a really, really short little bitty loop, but that's fine if that's what they want. It's easy enough to do. But anyway, what you do is you measure from the whip finish or the knot that you have in the hook, and you measure up, and if it's going to be an 8-inch snell, you measure up 8 inches and take a marker. Back in the day when I was doing it for that hardware store in Iowa, I used a carpenter's pencil, which is one of these kind of wide flat pencils that's pretty soft lead, and I would mark that spot. And then you come forward 1.25 inches and mark that spot. And you remember the first loop that I made that I rolled back? Well, you roll back that first 8-inch mark and lay it in the pinch. Then you take the second loop and bring it around and make sure that the second notch or marker that you put on the monofilament goes into the pinch, so that you've got a shorter loop there and a longer loop. Then you lay the monofilament across there and pull it through. And what happens is those two markers that you put land on top of each other, making an 8-inch long snell and a loop that's out of 1.25 inches material.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got this stuff.
Just a minute. We're done with our presentation, so let's get to the point where we can just talk to each other. Let me, so we can see what's going on here. Okay, what do you want to do, Jim?
Well, this stuff, it's like monofilament. I think it is. I got it when Ted Niedermeyer was giving away stuff. And I don't know, I thought he was using it for snelling up some of the old like type of wet flies, and when you used to get them. But I've pulled on it and it's pretty strong, so it's probably a 10-pound,
Yeah,
at least 10-pound monofilament. But I got
I
feeling, yeah,
recognize that stuff. That's what we used to tie our the
snelled hooks.
the hardware store guy gave me some of that to tie the snells out of.
Okay.
And I think it was some kind of monofilament, but like all the monofilament back in the 50s, it was hard and had a memory like crazy. You had to use a piece of rubber inner tube and stretch it through the rubber inner tubes to get it straightened out.
Huh. And then I got one other thing to show you. That was my first in-hand tie. We had a guy come from Italy to one of our Atlantic salmon, and he wanted to teach us how to tie in hand.
Uh-huh.
And so, he gave us all the materials and stuff, and it looks like crap, but
All I can tell you, it's a heck of a lot better than mine would look like.
but we had the gut eye and the horns and everything on it, and
That must have been kind of fun.
yeah, it was interesting because he had there's a term, your thread in catch, and it was a way of taking your tying thread down to your like, instead of having a weight hanging off of it, you could put it, wrap it around your little finger. And when you did that, it put tension. And
Sure.
by stretching your little finger down or pulling on it, you'd have the hook up and your fingers up here, and then you'd wrap the thread there. And by putting a little tension on it, you could keep that. And then you could pick up things with the other hand.
Sure.
That's in
Jim, that
Kelson's
stuff you
book.
got in your hand there, I think that's gut, isn't it?
The what?
Is that stuff that you got in your hand? Maybe gut? Gut used to come like that in bundles.
This isn't gut. This is the monofilament. He did give me I got from his stuff bundles that were 1 foot long, and there was 100 strands of gut in each bundle, and I had 10 bundles. So I had 1,000 feet of gut that was 1 foot long. And I have stretched all of it now into, and it was fine gut, because if you remember Alec Jackson's gut, he used 3 strands. Well, it would take 5 or 6 of my strands to make that 3-strand stuff that Alec Jackson had. And I got a whole bunch of it, and I think I gave it to some to somebody here at one time.
I see that David Buckner was asking about hackle pliers, and as far as tools now, when I tie in hand now, I was trying to simulate what we were up against back in the 50s, and with no tools. That's what I was doing tonight. But when I tie in hand now, I tie in hand with all the advantages, plus the advantage of all the tools, hackle pliers. In fact, the hackle pliers just clipped onto the hook, keeps things from coming apart like Jim was talking about while you set it down and go looking for materials. And the bobbin holder is awful handy, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that's real handy. But I wasn't trying to accomplish that tonight.
He also wants to know what size of hooks were we tying on in the early days. And I probably tied, a 12 would have been big.
Little.
I'm sorry, a 12 would have been, I think of it as big now. A 12 would have been little.
Yeah.
We tied probably 6, 8, 10s, 12s.
Yeah. Well, if you'll recall, last week I shared a page from a catalog, a 1940 catalog of that company that produced all those flies with those treadle machines. And the smallest fly they sold was 16s. And at that same time, Gretchen's father was tying commercially. He never tied anything less than a 12. It was all...
He tied a 14 once in a while.
Once in a while, a 14? Okay. But for the biggest part, it was sizes 6 to 12. And, I kind of chuckled at his big old flies on their snells and everything. And he came to visit us in Montana when I was working there as a guide. And we all went to the river together. And I said, well, Dub, I'll give you one of my flies if you want it. He said, no, I'll do just fine. He kicked our butt with those big old flies. Let me tell you what. So all I can tell you is sometimes it's just showing the fish something they haven't seen before or what, I don't know, but he did very well.
He was pretty proud of himself.
Proud of himself. He kicked the guide's butt. That just tickled him to death. So anyhow, anything else?
I got something to show.
Who is this?
Lou up here.
Lou? Okay, let me get you highlighted
Hey,
here.
Bruce, you see my little bowl? I put my little tiny mouth.
There you go, Lou.
Yeah, last week we were talking to snells, and again tonight, and here's some that were tied in the late 1800s to early 1900s, and they were tied by William Mills and Company. These were tied on very fine hooks, sneck offset hooks, and they were used with the snell, but with these were the gut. And you can see that, and like when Gretchen said her dad would put the flies together on the snell, they called it a bouquet. Well, my uncle, they always called this a spray of flies. So I guess it depends where you were and what the terminology was. But there was this one here, the red quill.
What are flies? I didn't get that.
What's that?
What they called it a what?
A spray.
Spray. Okay.
Okay.
Spray of fly. And this one here is black Palmer, and these are size 10. And yeah, and this is the way they used to come like that. And I just saved them through all the years. And yeah, and they're very, very well tied. And the heads are very tiny, you can see.
Those are tiny.
Yeah, and they're blind eye hook.
You said you saved them all these years, Lou. I had no idea you were from the 1800s.
Well, I got something here, and another newer one. And we were talking about how people don't really snell anymore. Well, here's a fly by Alec Jackson, and it's got an eye on it, as you can see, but it's got the monofilament and it comes out through the eye. And this was tied in the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah,
and
you know, well.
Yeah, that's what I grew up on. That style of in the 60s, all the wet flies came like that.
Yeah, that's one of his spade flies.
Yeah, exactly. And with the way the snell goes through, it keeps the fly true and straight for a lot of people that would swing flies, especially the old wet fly fishermen. And they would always loop to loop. And when I was a kid, I would tie on to the hook, and my uncle would always beat me tying flies because he would just loop to loop. He could change flies so quick. And he said the flies would swim truer in the water. So it's a preference, and even to this day, you know, people still do it.
Very, very interesting. It's
Because our eyesight gets worse too. A loop to loop hookup would be really handy.
sounds like a good idea if I can find the loop. Anyway,
Al, check these
anything
out.
else? Just a sec. Just remove the spotlight. Who wants to go next?
Here you go, Al, talking about snells.
Okay, just a minute. Let me get you spotlighted. There you are.
This is a fly that I picked up from a gentleman for pike, and he's got a wire leader snelled in.
Oh.
So, and again, a loop-to-loop connection. So,
But some of our
still
guys
around, they're
down,
still being used.
some of our guys down south could probably tell us a little bit. I seem to remember some snells when I went tarpon fishing. I don't know, several years ago. That with the wire loop snells. David, is that still something that's a common thing?
It is, yeah, it is up here. I mean, there's not many guys that fish for the fly rod for northerns up here, but the few that do, that's what they use. They snell their flies and then do a loop to loop on them.
David, do you?
I can't tell you. We don't have tarpon in this area to speak of. More
okay.
South Florida. Yeah.
Yeah, as I recall, the guide that we went with a guy named Lenny Moffel, so that those of you from Oregon will know who I'm talking about, or from North Idaho, he used to live there too. I knew Lenny back when he was had an auto body shop before he decided to go to Florida and become a guide. But anyhow, I went down to fish with him in the Keys for tarpon, and all of his stuff was snelled wire hooks that were about 1.5 feet long with a loop in them, and then he'd tie them onto the regular tippet of the fly, which, as far as I was concerned, the tippet they were using on those tarpon was as big as my fly line was back in Idaho. So anyhow, anything else? Okay, you're spotlighted, Amy.
Okay, when I'm teaching children, I put the backs of earrings on the hook to keep them from getting stuck.
Ah.
And it works really well, even with adults if they're getting butterfingers and they keep pricking themselves. So
sure.
That's a very simple solution.
Good idea. Thank you, Amy.
Inexpensive too.
Well, then we'll do.
Evelyn?
Oh, you're on, Evelyn. So nice to see you again.
I know, it's so nice to be here.
Did you do any drawings?
Yes, I did.
Oh, great. I didn't know you were on, or I would have called you a long time. Let me spotlight you.
That's quite all right.
Okay, here you go.
Okay, here we go. All right, here's Gretchen's Gray Hackle Yellow. Whoops.
Looking good. All right.
All right. And then I guess you call this the Bucktail Streamer. I don't.
Correct.
Oh, good.
Yeah, looks
just like
good.
it. Yeah.
Looks good.
Oh,
Good job.
Thank you. And then here's here's the one you tied by hand. Except it's really little.
All I can tell you is a heck of a lot better job than I did. I can tell
I
you.
don't know about that. It was so nice
Oh,
to
yeah.
come.
Thank you so much, Evelyn.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. I'm glad to be back.
Good to see you back again. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. For now, it's a wrap. Until next time, we'll see you next week.